The gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass. Carter's bullet hit Ethan in the left shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Blood spread dark and fast across the snow. But his rifle was already moving, tracking the bounty hunter, even as pain exploded through his body. Ethan's shot hit Carter's center mass. The man dropped like a stone. Grace screamed and ran to him. Emma cried from the doorway, her blind eyes wide with terror. "Papa, don't leave me!" $300. That's what Grace was worth. A fugitive nun he had married 3 days ago to keep her safe. Now he was bleeding in the snow because he couldn't let them take her. But this story doesn't begin with bullets and blood. It begins 3 weeks earlier in a blizzard when Ethan Cordell made a choice that would cost him everything. The old rocking chair creaked like the bones of the mountains themselves. Ethan Cordell sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the autumn mist roll through the Blue Ridge valleys below. At 79 years old, his hair had gone the color of winter frost, his beard long and white as fresh snow. But his hands, gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with wilderness, still held the strength of a man who knew how to survive when softer men would perish. Beside him sat William, his 15-year-old grandson. The boy had arrived 3 months prior, orphaned by the Spanish flu that had torn through the cities like a demon unleashed. The same flu that had taken Ethan's son. The same flu that had taken his beloved wife Grace. William had been silent for weeks after his arrival, his grief a stone lodged in his throat too heavy to speak around. But today, on this gray October afternoon in 1920, he finally found his voice. "Grandpa," the boy said quietly, his eyes fixed on the 2 graves beneath the ancient oak tree at the edge of the clearing. "Why don't you ever go down to town?" "Not even when Grandma died." Ethan's gaze drifted to the wall inside the cabin, visible through the open door. There, hanging on a wooden peg worn smooth by decades of use, was a rosary. Not the delicate kind priests wore in their churches down in the valley, but something rough-hewn and personal. Each bead had been carved from black walnut by hands that knew how to kill, but had chosen instead to create. The wood was dark with age, and the oils from countless prayers, and each bead bore the distinct marks of a knife blade wielded by someone who understood the value of patience. "Because some stories shouldn't be forgotten, boy," Ethan said, his voice carrying the weight of nearly half a century. "And this here is the story of the only woman who ever made me believe in salvation." The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing not the autumn of 1920, but the winter of 1873. He reached for the rosary, his fingers tracing the worn beads, as if reading the braille of his own history. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming something harder and colder, the voice of the man he had once been. "It started with a blizzard," he said, "and a woman who shouldn't have survived." William leaned forward, sensing that his grandfather was about to reveal something he had kept locked away for years. Ethan Cordell began to speak, and as he did, the present faded away like morning mist replaced by the harsh and unforgiving world of December 1873. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, there existed a place so remote that even the Cherokee who had once hunted these ridges had left it unnamed. The white men who came later called it Deep Hollow, not out of any poetic impulse, but simply because that's what it was. A hollow so deep and isolated that a man could live there his entire life and never see another human soul if he chose. In the winter of 1873, that's exactly what Ethan Cordell was trying to do. The cabin stood like a fortress against the world built from chestnut logs he had felled himself and chinked with clay and moss gathered from the mountainside. The roof was split oak shingles, each one shaped by hand with a froe and mallet. One room, one window, one door, one life stripped down to its bare essentials. Inside a fire burned in the stone hearth he had mortared with his own hands, using techniques learned during 4 years of war. Animal pelts covered the floor, bear and deer and wolf, each one taken with either his rifle or his traps. 12 iron traps hung from the rafters like some macabre chandelier, their teeth still stained with the rust-colored residue of old blood. A Sharps rifle caliber .50 leaned against the wall beside the door. That rifle had killed 23 men during the war. Ethan knew because he had counted every single one. He could still see their faces when he closed his eyes at night, though he had stopped trying to remember their names years ago. In the corner on a small bed built from rough-hewn pine sat Emma. 9 years old, blonde hair like her mother, eyes the color of a winter sky. But those eyes were clouded and sightless. She had been blind for a year now since the fever that nearly took her life. Ethan had held her through 3 days of delirium, pouring creek water down her throat and praying to a God he no longer believed in. She survived, but the fever stole her sight as payment for her life. Now she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted in that particular way blind children develop, listening to the world instead of seeing it. Her other senses had sharpened to compensate for her loss. She could hear things no sighted person would notice. She could smell changes in the weather hours before they arrived. She had learned to navigate the cabin and the immediate surroundings by memory and sound, moving with a confidence that would surprise strangers who didn't know her. "What do you hear, girl?" Ethan asked, as he pulled on his bearskin coat preparing to check his trap line. Emma's head turned slightly toward the window, her clouded eyes seeming to focus on something beyond the walls. "4 squirrels in the oak tree by the well," she said. "One of them has a limp in the left leg, and the wind is changing. Snow's coming, Pa. Heavy snow." Ethan allowed himself the ghost of a smile. If his daughter could not see the world, she had learned to know it in ways he never could. It was a poor compensation for her blindness, but it was something. In these mountains, awareness meant survival. He walked to her and placed a rough, scarred hand on her head. "I'm checking the trap line," he said. "Be back before dark." "Be careful, Pa," she replied, which was what she always said. "Always am," he answered, which was the lie he always told. The truth was that Ethan Cordell had not been careful since Anna died. He had been reckless in his grief, taking risks no sane man would take, almost hoping that the mountains would claim him and end the hollow ache that never seemed to fade. But the mountains had refused his silent offering. They had let him live, perhaps as punishment, perhaps as mercy. He no longer knew which. Outside, the world was iron and ice. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the storm Emma had predicted. Ethan moved through the forest with the practiced silence of a man who had spent 4 years avoiding enemy pickets and twice that long hunting animals that could hear a footfall from 100 yards away. His trap line ran 3 miles in a rough circle around the cabin, a carefully planned route that took him through the best hunting grounds while keeping him close enough to home that he could return quickly if Emma needed him. 12 traps set for marten and beaver, whose winter pelts brought good money from the traders in Harper's Ridge, the nearest town a full day's hard ride away. The traps were his livelihood and his obsession. Each morning he would check them, reset them, move them if necessary. Each evening he would return with whatever he had caught, skin it, stretch the hide, salt the meat. It was methodical work requiring neither thought nor feeling, which suited him perfectly. The first 11 traps were empty or held animals too small to be worth the skinning. Such was the nature of trapping. You had to check every trap every day because a catch left too long would be eaten by scavengers or would rot, ruining the pelt. It was a hard way to make a living, but it was a living that required no interaction with other human beings, which was exactly what Ethan wanted. But the 12th trap, set near a creek that ran swift and black over smooth stones, held something unexpected. A rabbit lay dead in the steel jaws, its body already frozen stiff by the cold. But that wasn't what made Ethan stop and drop his hand to the knife at his belt. Beside the trap, pressed into the thin crust of snow, were footprints. Human footprints. Small ones like a woman's boot, leading away from the trap toward the steep face of the mountain where the rocks rose like broken teeth. Trappers in these mountains were solitary by nature and territorial by necessity. A stranger on your trap line usually meant one thing: theft, or worse. Ethan stood motionless for a long moment, his eyes scanning the tree line, his ears tuned for any sound that didn't belong. He saw nothing, heard nothing except the wind beginning to pick up, carrying the first hints of the coming storm. The tracks wandered erratically, the gait of someone lost or injured. Twice he saw where the person had fallen, and once he found a handprint in the snow, fingers splayed wide as if begging the earth for mercy. The snow began to fall. Fat flakes at first, then smaller, harder, driven by a wind that cut through his bearskin coat as if it were cotton. Ethan knew these storms. He had lived through enough of them to recognize the signs. In an hour, these tracks would be gone, buried under fresh powder. In 2 hours, the world would be nothing but white silence. In 3 hours, anyone caught outside without shelter would be dead. He should turn back. He should return to the cabin to Emma and leave this stranger to whatever fate had brought them to his mountain. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But Ethan found himself following the tracks anyway. He found her 200 yards from the trap, collapsed at the base of a hemlock tree. A woman kneeling in the snow, her body bent forward as if in prayer. She wore a heavy black cloak that hung from her shoulders like a shroud soaked through and already beginning to freeze. A hood covered her head. Her hands clutched a small package wrapped in oilcloth, holding it against her chest like a mother protecting a child. Ethan approached slowly, his hand still on his knife. "Lady," he called out, his voice harsh in the cold air, "what in God's name are you doing out here?" She lifted her head with excruciating slowness. The hood fell back, and Ethan saw her face for the first time. Green eyes the color of spring leaves, bright and feverish against skin gone pale as milk. Red hair plastered to her skull by melted snow. Lips blue with cold, trembling as she tried to form words. But her jaw shook so violently that no sound came out. She was in the advanced stages of hypothermia, her body shutting down system by system. Then Ethan saw the veil. Black fabric beneath the hood, the kind worn by nuns in their convents, the kind worn by servants of God. His stomach turned to stone. Suddenly, he was not in the forest anymore. He was in his cabin 4 years earlier, watching Anna die. Hearing her scream his name over and over as the baby killed her from the inside, seeing the blood spread across the sheets like spilled wine, feeling her hand grow cold in his as the life drained out of her eyes. He was outside the cabin on his knees in the mud, begging God to save her. "Please, God, please, I'll do anything. Just don't take her from me." He was at the Baptist mission, standing before Father Marcus, who looked at him with cold fish eyes and said, "$20 for a blessing. Do you have it?" And Ethan pouring out his pockets, counting the coins with shaking hands. $7.35, everything he had earned from 6 months of trapping. "Please, Father, she's dying. My wife is dying." "Then come back when you have the full amount," Father Marcus had said, and closed the door in his face. Anna died at 3:17 in the morning. The baby died an hour later, his tiny lungs never having drawn a full breath. And when Ethan went to bury them, Father Marcus told him they could not be laid to rest in consecrated ground. "She died in sin," the priest said. "The child was never baptized. They cannot rest with the righteous." Ethan had broken the priest's nose with one punch. Then he had dug 2 graves himself in the rain outside the church fence. Mother and son together in the cold earth, with no priest to say words over them, and no one to mourn but him. That was the day Ethan Cordell stopped believing in God. And now here was one of God's servants kneeling in the snow on his mountain, dying just as Anna had died. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let her freeze, to let her die. One less hypocrite in the world. Let God save his own. But then he thought of Emma, alone in the cabin waiting for him. What kind of man would he be if he let this woman die? What could he teach his daughter about mercy and humanity if he walked away from someone in need, no matter who they were or what they represented? The war had taught Ethan many things, and one of them was this: a man could lose everything in this world: his home, his family, his faith. But the one thing he could never afford to lose was his sense of who he was, because once that was gone, there was nothing left worth saving. Ethan cursed low and vicious, the words torn away by the wind. Then he bent down and grabbed the woman under her arms. "Get up," he growled. "If you want to live, you get up now." She tried. Her legs buckled beneath her. Ethan caught her weight, all of it, and realized she was lighter than she should have been. Starving, probably. He slung her over his shoulder like a deer carcass, not gently but efficiently. The package she had been clutching fell into the snow. Ethan picked it up with his free hand. It was heavy, solid, suspicious. He shoved it into his coat. The walk back to the cabin took an hour. The woman passed out halfway there, her body going limp. Ethan's shoulder screamed where the war wound lived, the old Confederate mini-ball still lodged near the bone. But he didn't stop. Stopping meant death, and he had carried wounded men longer distances than this during the war. Emma heard them coming. She stood in the doorway, her blind eyes wide and somehow knowing. "Pa," she called out. "Did you bring something? A person?" Ethan said, his breath coming hard. "Move aside, girl." He carried the woman inside and laid her on Emma's bed, the only bed in the cabin. The nun's cloak was frozen solid, the fabric stiff as armor. Ethan pulled his knife and cut it away, the material cracking like thin ice as the blade sheared through it. Beneath the cloak, she wore the full habit of her order, black wool soaked through and clinging to her skeletal frame. A rosary hung from her belt, the beads carved from walnut wood and worn smooth by countless prayers. Ethan stared at that rosary. His hands shook with something that might have been rage or might have been grief or might have been both. He wanted to throw her back outside, to let the mountain have her, to let God's will be done, since God seemed so fond of taking people from him. But Emma crawled forward on her hands and knees, her small fingers reaching out until they found the woman's arm. "Pa," she said softly, "her hand is cold as death. She's going to die." Ethan closed his eyes and breathed deep, fighting the war inside himself. Then he began stripping the wet clothes away, leaving only the woman's undergarments for modesty's sake. He wrapped her in a bearskin, the fur thick and warm, and pulled her close to the fire. He stoked the flames until they roared, burning through his carefully hoarded wood supply, but right now that didn't matter. Emma sat beside the stranger, holding her hand, trying to share what little warmth the 9-year-old girl possessed. "Is she going to be okay, Pa?" she asked. "Don't know, girl," Ethan said honestly. "Don't know." Outside, the blizzard screamed like all the ghosts he had ever made. Morning came gray and dim. The storm had not stopped. It would not stop for 3 more days, which Ethan knew from experience, but which he did not mention to Emma. No sense worrying the girl about things she couldn't control. He had not slept. He sat in the corner of the cabin, his rifle across his knees, watching the nun sleep. Every time he tried to close his eyes, he saw Anna's face, heard her screams, saw the baby's tiny body blue and still, heard Father Marcus saying she died in sin. The woman stirred as the weak morning light filtered through the single window. Her eyes opened unfocused and confused. She looked at the rough log ceiling, at the animal pelts hanging on the walls, at the iron traps suspended from the rafters. Panic flooded her face. She sat up fast, the bearskin falling away, and realized she wore only her undergarments. She clutched the fur to her chest, her green eyes wide with fear. "Where am I?" she gasped. "Who are you?" Ethan did not move from the shadows. "I'm the man who saved your life," he said, his voice cold and flat. She turned toward his voice, and in the firelight she could see him properly for the first time. 6 feet tall and broad through the shoulders from years of splitting wood and hauling traps. Beard thick and dark, shot through with gray. Hair long, tied back with a strip of leather. Scars on his knuckles and face, including a long pale line from his left eyebrow to his jaw where a rebel saber had kissed him at Antietam. He wore buckskin and homespun clothes that had been patched so many times they were more patch than original fabric. A hunting knife the length of a man's forearm hung from his belt. He looked like what he was, a man the wilderness had claimed and made its own. "You're a trapper," the woman said, her Irish accent clear despite her fear. "I am," Ethan confirmed. "Where is my habit?" she asked, looking around. "My veil." Ethan gestured to the corner where he had hung her clothes to dry near the fire. "Getting dry," he said. "You were half frozen. Another hour and you'd be dead." The woman pulled the bearskin tighter around herself. "I need to leave," she said. "Can't." Ethan replied. "Storm's too bad. You'd be dead in 10 minutes." "Then I'll wait until it passes." Ethan stood and stepped into the light, letting her see him fully, letting her understand what kind of man she was dealing with. "Easy," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if she was easy or not. "I don't hurt women. You're safe here." "Am I?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "Am I safer than I was in that snowstorm?" Before Ethan could answer, Emma's voice came from the corner of the cabin, soft and curious. "Pa, is the lady awake?" The woman's eyes went to Emma, and she saw the clouded eyes, saw the way the girl turned her head to listen instead of look. Understanding crossed her face, and with it a softening of her fear. "You have a daughter?" she asked. "I do," Ethan said. "She's blind." "She is." The woman looked at Emma with something that might have been tenderness or might have been pity. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentler now. "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl replied. "What's yours?" The woman hesitated just for a moment. "Grace," she said. "But most people call me Grace." Ethan filed that information away. Not Sister Grace, just Grace, which suggested she either wasn't as attached to her vows as she should be, or she was trying to hide who she really was. "Why were you in the mountains, sister?" Ethan asked, the title sharp as a blade. "Far long way from a convent." Grace's jaw tightened. "I was traveling," she said. "I got lost." "Liar," Ethan said flatly. Her eyes snapped to his anger replacing fear. "Excuse me. Snow's been falling 2 days," Ethan said. "Covered all the trails. No one comes up this mountain unless they're looking for something or running from something." He walked to the table where he had placed the package she had been carrying. "Which one are you?" Grace said nothing, but her hand moved unconsciously to where the package had been, confirming what Ethan already suspected. Whatever was in that oilcloth bundle, it was important enough to die for. He unwrapped it slowly, deliberately, watching her face as he did. Inside was a reliquary ornate and golden, about the size of a man's fist. It was engraved with the image of St. Patrick and set with 5 emeralds the size of thumbnails. Even in the dim light of the cabin, it gleamed with the unmistakable luster of real gold. Ethan had never held anything worth so much money in his entire life. He estimated it at $500, maybe more. 5 years of trapping income contained in something that would fit in his pocket. He looked at Grace. "So you're a thief and a liar," he said. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm not a thief," she said. "Mother Superior Adelaide accused me to cover her own crime. She was selling that reliquary to a merchant in New York for $500. Money that should have fed orphans. I took it back before she could complete the sale. But she reported me first, faster than I could reach the bishop." "Convenient story," Ethan said. "It's the truth," Grace insisted. Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness and old rage. "The truth," he said. "You people don't know the meaning of the word. You preach mercy and practice cruelty. You take money from the poor and call it God's will. You let people die and say it's part of His plan." He threw the reliquary onto the bed beside her. Grace caught it, held it close like it was evidence instead of treasure. Ethan turned away, unable to look at her anymore without seeing Father Marcus's face. "You can stay until the storm passes," he said. "Then you leave. I don't want your kind in my house." "My kind?" Grace asked softly. "Holy folk?" Ethan said the words dripping with venom. "Servants of God. You're all the same." Before Grace could respond, Emma spoke from her corner of the cabin. Her small voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "But Pa," she said, "what if she's telling the truth, like when people didn't believe you about Ma not being a sinner?" Ethan froze. The words hit him like a rifle shot to the chest. He looked down at his daughter's upturned face, at her blind eyes that somehow seemed to see straight into his soul, seeing things he didn't want anyone to see. Then he looked at Grace, really looked at her for the first time since bringing her into his home. He saw the tears on her face. He saw the way she held the reliquary like it was evidence, not treasure. And he saw something else. When the bearskin had slipped from her shoulders, he had seen marks on her wrists, thin, pale lines crossing the skin, scars, the kind left by ropes or whips. "They beat you," he said. It wasn't a question. Grace quickly pulled the bearskin up to hide the scars, but it was too late. He had seen them. Mother Superior said pain purifies the soul. Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan knew those scars. He had 16 of them himself, crisscrossing his back like a map of his childhood. Put there by his father's belt between the ages of 12 and 16, each lash accompanied by scripture. "Spare the rod and spoil the child. I discipline those I love as the Lord disciplines those he loves." He had left home at 16 and never looked back, never spoke to his father again, and he had sworn he would never be like that man, would never raise his hand to someone weaker than himself, would never use God as an excuse for cruelty. But he had failed. Anna had died because he couldn't pay $20 for a blessing. Emma was blind because he couldn't afford a proper doctor when the fever came. He had failed everyone he ever loved, and now here was this woman beaten by the very people who claimed to serve a loving God, and he was treating her with the same cruelty they had shown her. Ethan walked to the wall and put his fist through it. The log cracked. His knuckles split and bled. Emma jumped at the sound. Grace flinched. Ethan pulled his hand back, not feeling the pain, not caring about the blood. "They're all the same," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Every single one of them. They use God like a weapon. They hurt people and call it holy. They take everything good and pure and they twist it into something cruel." He grabbed his coat and walked to the door. He needed the cold. He needed distance. He needed anything except the sight of Grace's scarred wrists and the memory of his own scarred back. "You can stay until spring if you need to," he said without looking at her. The words came from somewhere deep inside him, from a part of him he thought had died with Anna. "But no praying in this house, and you don't teach my girl about God. That's the deal." "I promise," Grace said softly. Emma smiled, sensing the shift in her father's voice, even if she couldn't see his face. "Pa never lets strangers stay more than one night," she said. "You must be special, Miss Grace." Ethan said nothing. He walked out into the blizzard, needing the cold to wash away the heat in his chest. Behind him, Grace held the reliquary and wondered if she had just been saved or condemned. The storm screamed around the cabin, and the mountains kept their secrets as they always had. 3 days later, the storm finally broke. The sun came out hard and bright on the endless white landscape, turning the world into something clean and new. Ethan prepared to make the journey to Henry Morrison's cabin, the nearest neighbor 15 miles away, through mountain passes that would kill a man who didn't know them. Henry was 68 years old, half wild himself, a former fur trader who had stayed in the mountains when everyone else went west chasing gold. He was also the only person within 50 miles that Ethan trusted, which wasn't saying much since Ethan didn't really trust anyone anymore. The journey took most of a day, following trails only a mountain man would recognize. When Ethan finally arrived at Henry's cabin, the old man was sitting by his fire whittling a pipe stem, his beard so long it reached his belt. "Cordell," Henry said without looking up, "thought you'd froze to death up there." "Not yet," Ethan replied. Henry grunted and reached into a pile of supplies he had collected from Harper's Ridge the week before. Mail and newspapers, ammunition and coffee, salt and sugar, the necessities of life this far from civilization. "Got your order," Henry said. "Salt, ammunition, coffee. That'll be $12. Ethan counted out the coins, mostly silver with a few gold pieces mixed in. Henry took them and then handed over a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded many times. "Saw this in town," he said. "Thought you might want to know." Ethan unfolded the paper. It was a wanted poster, the kind printed up by sheriffs and bounty hunters, with a crude sketch at the top and text below. Wanted. Sister Grace Brennan. Theft of Holy Reliquary. $300 reward. Contact Mother Superior, Adelaide, Boston. Below the text was a sketch, rough but good enough. Green eyes, red hair, though the drawing was in black ink. The particular shape of her face. It was definitely Grace. Ethan stared at the poster. $300. That was a fortune. More money than he had ever seen in one place in his entire life. More money than he would make in 3 years of trapping. Enough money to take Emma to a city doctor. Maybe buy medicine. Maybe pay for treatment that could give his daughter back her sight. A chance, however small, to undo one of the many ways he had failed her. All he had to do was turn Grace in. Put her on a horse, take her down to Harper's Ridge, collect the reward. She had lied to him about her name, or at least not told him her full name. She was a fugitive from the law. He owed her nothing. Henry watched him carefully. "That the woman at your place?" he asked. Ethan folded the poster and slipped it into his coat. "Maybe," he said. $300 is a lot of money, Ethan," Henry said. "Could change things for Emma." "I know," Ethan said. But Ethan thought of Grace's scars, her work-roughened hands, the way she sang to Emma while she worked teaching the girl to read Braille, using a Bible she had brought, punching holes in the pages with a needle to make raised dots. He thought of the reliquary and her story about Mother Adelaide selling it. He thought of Father Marcus letting Anna die and then refusing to bury her. He thought of Emma asking, "What if she's telling the truth?" "But nothing," Ethan said. "Thanks for the supplies, Henry." He rode back through the snow, the wanted poster burning like hot iron against his chest. When he reached the cabin, he saw Grace through the window. She was teaching Emma to trace the shapes of letters, guiding the girl's fingers over the raised dots she had made. "E," Grace said. "Feel the single dot. That's the letter E for Emma." Emma laughed. Actually laughed. It was the first time Ethan had heard that sound in more than a year since before the fever took his daughter's sight. The sound hit him harder than any blow he had ever received in the war. He dismounted and walked to the fire pit outside the cabin. He pulled out the wanted poster and looked at it one last time. $300. Emma's only chance for a normal life. Gone. He fed the poster to the flames and watched it burn. The paper curled and blackened and turned to ash, and with it went Emma's chance at seeing again. But some things were worth more than money. Some things were worth more than sight. Ethan didn't know what those things were yet, but he knew Grace was somehow connected to them. That night after Emma had gone to sleep, Ethan sat by the fire and began carving. He had started something new working late into the night when the others slept. Black walnut, hard and dense, the kind of wood that would last forever if treated right. He was making a rosary, not for himself. He would never pray again, would never ask God for anything, would never bow his head to a deity that took more than he gave. But Grace's rosary had broken 2 days ago, the string rotting through after years of use. She had wept quietly when she thought no one was listening, mourning the loss of something that clearly meant everything to her. So Ethan carved. 59 beads, each one shaped by hand with his knife. It would take weeks to finish, but he had time. And she deserved something beautiful. Everyone deserved something beautiful, even if the world seemed determined to take beauty away from those who needed it most. Outside, the mountains stood silent under the stars, keeping their ancient watch over the hollow where 3 broken people were slowly learning how to be whole again. 3 days trapped in a cabin built for 1 man and 1 child, now holding 3 souls in uneasy proximity. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like something alive and angry, and inside a different kind of storm was brewing. Ethan taught Grace the rules of survival without speaking more than necessary. He showed her how to split wood, how to angle the axe so the blade bit clean instead of bouncing off the frozen timber. He showed her how to fetch water from the well when the surface froze 2 inches thick, how to break through the ice without falling in. He showed her how to cook rabbit and venison over an open fire, the meat tough and gamey, nothing like the soft meals she must have known in Boston. Grace worked without complaint. Her hands blistered within the first day the soft skin of a woman who had spent her life in a convent, tearing open as she gripped the axe handle. The blisters bled by the 2nd day. By the 3rd day, they had begun to callous over the flesh, hardening into something more durable. Her shoulders ached from the axe. Her fingers went numb from the cold, despite the wool gloves Ethan had grudgingly given her. Her back hurt from hauling water and wood. But she never asked for rest. She never complained. She simply worked, her jaw set with determination, her green eyes focused on each task as if her life depended on mastering it, which Ethan supposed it probably did. He found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't aware, watching the way she moved with a kind of grim efficiency that suggested she had known hard work before, even if not this particular kind. Watching the way she never gave up even when her hands shook from exhaustion and her breath came hard in the thin mountain air. Respect grew in him, unwanted and unbidden. He didn't want to respect her, didn't want to see her as anything other than a representative of the institution that had failed him so completely. But respect came anyway, like water seeping through a crack in stone, slow and inevitable. Emma loved her. That much was obvious from the first day. The girl had been lonely, achingly so, with only Ethan for company. And Ethan was a man of few words and long silences, better suited to teaching survival than providing companionship. But Grace sang while she worked. Old Irish songs, hymns stripped of their religious weight and transformed into simple melodies. Her voice was alto, rich and warm, filling the small cabin with something that hadn't existed there in years. Something that might have been called joy if Ethan remembered what that word meant. He listened from outside the cabin, pretending to check the traps or split more wood. Grace's voice carried through the walls, and he found himself standing still, axe forgotten in his hands, just listening. Anna had sung too. Different songs, but the same warmth, the same quality of bringing light into dark places. It hurt to listen. It hurt more to walk away. So he stayed hidden behind his work and let the music wash over him like rain on drought-hardened earth. On the third evening, as the storm finally began to ease, Grace bathed behind a canvas curtain Ethan had hung across one corner of the cabin. He had heated water in the big iron pot, a luxury in winter, normally reserved for illness or emergency. But Grace had worked hard for 3 days, and even his stone heart could recognize that she had earned it. Steam rose from behind the curtain, filling the cabin with damp warmth. Ethan sat at the table cleaning his rifle, his back to the curtain, professional and respectful. Emma had already fallen asleep in her corner, exhausted from a day spent learning to weave baskets from pine needles, her small hands finally mastering the pattern Grace had taught her. The curtain had a gap, not large but enough. When Grace lifted her arms to wash her hair, the firelight behind her showed her silhouette against the canvas. Ethan's eyes went to it involuntarily, and what he saw made his hands stop moving. Scars. Not just the marks on her wrists that he had seen before. These were thick, raised, crisscrossing her spine from shoulders to waist, the kind of scars left by a whip, not a single beating but many. Years of them laid down one atop another until her back was a road map of pain. The rag fell from Ethan's fingers. His throat closed. He knew those scars. He had 16 of them himself, put there by his father's belt over 4 years of what the old man called discipline and what Ethan had learned to call torture. "Who did that to you?" His voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried in the small space. Grace gasped. She pulled her shift up quickly, covering herself, but it was too late. He had seen. "No one," she said, but her voice shook. "Don't lie to me," Ethan said. His hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to make the wood creak. "I've got the same marks." Silence. Just the crackle of the fire and the diminishing howl of the wind outside. Then Grace spoke, her voice so small he almost didn't hear it. "Mother Superior Adelaide," she said, "every time I questioned, every time I disobeyed. The last time was when I asked why the convent was selling food meant for the poor." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping harsh against the floor. He strode to the door and gripped the frame so hard the wood groaned under his fingers. His whole body shook with barely contained rage. All he felt was rage, pure and hot and consuming. Rage at Mother Superior Adelaide. Rage at Father Marcus. Rage at his own father. Rage at every person who had ever used God as an excuse to hurt someone weaker than themselves. Behind the curtain, Grace flinched at the sound of his anger. Emma shifted in her sleep, but didn't wake. Grace stood trembling not from fear of Ethan but from the realization that he understood, that he knew, that he had scars too. "They're all the same," he said, his voice shaking. "Every single one of them. Use God like a weapon." He grabbed his coat and walked out into the snow. He needed the cold, needed distance, needed anything except the image of Grace's scarred back overlapping with the memory of his own. Behind him, Grace stood trembling, not from fear of Ethan, but from the realization that he understood, that he knew, that he had scars too. For the first time since leaving Boston, she didn't feel alone. 2 weeks after the blizzard ended, Ethan made the journey to Henry Morrison's cabin again. The old mountain man had supplies waiting along with news from the outside world that Ethan normally didn't care about, but felt compelled to hear anyway. Henry's cabin smelled of tobacco and bear grease, the accumulated odor of a man who had lived alone for so long he had forgotten that other people might find such things unpleasant. The old trapper sat by his fire working on a new set of traps, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble despite their age. "Cordell," Henry said without looking up. "How's that woman working out?" Ethan grunted, which was about as much conversation as he was willing to offer on the subject. He counted out $12 for the supplies Henry had brought from Harper's Ridge, then waited while the old man sorted through his pile of goods. "Got something else for you," Henry said and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Came in last week. Figured you'd want to see it." Ethan unfolded the paper. Another wanted poster, this one more official looking than the last. Sister Grace Brennan. Theft of Holy Reliquary. $300 reward. The sketch was better this time, more detailed. There was no mistaking who it was meant to represent. "Posted in 3 counties now," Henry said, watching Ethan's face carefully. "Bounty hunter's been asking about her in Harper's Ridge. Man named Carter Blackwell. Heard of him?" Ethan shook his head. "Out of Boston," Henry continued. "Used to be a soldier like you. Now he tracks people for money. Good at it, too. They say he never fails to bring in his bounty." "She's still at your place?" Henry asked after a moment. Ethan folded the poster and put it in his coat. "Maybe. $300 could change a lot of things, Ethan. Could get Emma to a real doctor. Could give that girl a chance." "I know what it could do." Ethan said, his voice harder than he intended. Henry held up his hands. "Just saying, man's got to think about his own blood first. That's the law of these mountains." Ethan left without another word, the poster heavy in his pocket. He rode back slowly, thinking about what Henry had said. The old man was right. $300 could change everything. But what would it cost him? What would it cost Emma to know her father had sold out someone who needed help for money? More than that, what would it cost him to know he had become the kind of man who would do such a thing? When he got home, he found Grace in the cabin bent over Emma, the two of them laughing together over something. The sound stopped him in the doorway. Laughter. Real laughter, bright and genuine, the kind that came from joy rather than obligation. When he got home, he found Grace and Emma laughing together over a basket of pine needles they were weaving. The sound stopped him in the doorway. Grace had tied her red hair back with a strip of cloth, and her face was flushed from the heat of the fire. Emma was smiling, her blind eyes somehow brighter than they had been in months. They looked for all the world like a mother and daughter sharing a moment of simple happiness. Ethan pulled the second wanted poster from his coat pocket. The first poster he had burned weeks ago was long gone, scattered as ash on the mountain wind. But this one was more official, posted in 3 counties. Henry had warned him about Carter Blackwell. He crumpled it in his fist and shoved it back into his pocket. He wouldn't burn this one. He would keep it as a reminder that the world still wanted to take Grace away from them, that the fight wasn't over yet. Maybe he was a fool. Maybe he was dooming Emma to a life of darkness because he couldn't bring himself to betray someone who trusted him. But he had made his choice. And Ethan Cordell was many things, but he was not the kind of man who went back on his word, even when that word was unspoken. 3 weeks into Grace's stay, Ethan couldn't sleep. The ghosts were too loud that night. Anna's screams echoing in his memory. The baby's weak cry. Father Marcus's cold eyes telling him his wife and son couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. He sat by the fire, whittling the rosary beads he had been working on for weeks now. Each bead took hours to shape, to smooth, to make perfect. The work was meditative, requiring just enough concentration to keep the darker thoughts at bay. Grace woke and saw him there in the firelight, his hands moving with patient precision over the wood. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "Never could," Ethan said. "Not when there are strangers in the house. I've been here 3 weeks. Still a stranger." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and came to sit across from him, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. The fire cast shadows across her face, making her hair glow like autumn leaves. "Why do you hate God so much?" she asked. "Not the church, not priests, but God himself." Ethan's knife stopped moving. The half-carved bead sat in his palm waiting. "Because he took everything I loved," he said finally. And then, for the first time since Anna died, Ethan told the whole story. He told her about Anna, the girl from the mill town who had loved him despite his scars and his silences. He told her about the pregnancy, about how they had wanted to marry but had no money for a proper wedding. He told her about the labor that went wrong, the baby coming breech, the blood that seemed like it would never stop flowing. He told her about Father Marcus and the $20 blessing fee, about pouring out his pockets and counting $7.35, about the priest closing the door in his face while Anna screamed in the cabin. His voice cracked when he described Anna's death, how she had called his name over and over until her voice went hoarse, how the baby had died an hour later, his tiny lungs never drawing a full breath, how Father Marcus had refused to bury them in the church cemetery because Anna had died in sin and the baby had never been baptized. "I broke his nose," Ethan said. "One punch. Heard the bone snap. Then I dug 2 graves myself in the rain outside the church fence. Buried my wife and my son in the mud while that priest watched from his window." Tears ran down his scarred face. He didn't try to wipe them away. "I asked God why," he said, begged him, prayed until my knees bled, got nothing back, just silence. So I stopped asking, stopped believing. Grace was crying too, but not from pity. From rage, pure burning rage. "That priest was wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "God would never demand money to save a life. That was evil, not faith." "But you still serve him," Ethan said. "Still wore the habit." Grace pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Not anymore," she said. "When I took the reliquary, I broke my vows. I'm not Sister Grace anymore. I'm just Grace Brennan. A woman who ran." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, saw the firelight catching in her hair, saw the determination in her eyes, saw the strength in her scarred hands. "Why did you run?" he asked. Grace met his gaze. "Because Mother Superior Adelaide locked me in the cellar for 3 days with rats. Said suffering would bring me closer to God. When I finally got out, I heard her arranging to sell the reliquary to a merchant for $500, money that should have fed orphans. So I stole it back. But she reported me first, faster than I could reach the bishop." "So you came here to disappear," Ethan said. "I came here to survive," Grace corrected. "There's a difference." Ethan reached up and unpinned her veil, the last piece of her habit she still wore when she slept. It fell away, and her hair tumbled free, red and copper and gold in the firelight, falling to her waist in waves. She had kept it pinned up since arriving, this last vestige of her former life. Now it was gone. Ethan stared. She was beautiful. Not in the delicate way Anna had been beautiful, but in the way mountains are beautiful, strong and wild and real. He turned away, his throat tight. "You should sleep," he said. Grace didn't move. "Ethan," she said, "why did you really let me stay?" "Emma needed someone," he said. "I couldn't be enough for her." "Is that the only reason?" Silence. The fire crackled. Snow whispered against the window. Outside, the night was deep and cold and full of stars that didn't care about the struggles of the people below them. Ethan stood and walked to the door. He spoke without turning. "No," he said, "it's not." He went outside into the cold, needing air, needing space, needing to put distance between himself and the feelings growing in his chest, like spring growth pushing through winter earth. Behind him, Grace sat by the fire, holding the blanket, her heart beating like a trapped bird in her chest. Neither of them slept that night. 3 days later, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the mountain silence. Ethan was in the forest, checking his trap line, when he heard it, the distinctive rhythm of a horse moving through snow at a careful pace. He froze his hand going to his knife. Company this deep in the mountains could only mean one thing: trouble. He made his way back to the cabin quickly but quietly, moving through the trees like a shadow. When he reached the clearing, he saw a man on horseback talking to Grace through the open cabin door. Emma stood just behind her, one small hand clutching Grace's skirt. The man was tall and lean, dressed in a long duster coat the color of dried blood. He rode a black gelding that looked as tired as its rider. But what caught Ethan's attention was the way the man carried himself, the way his eyes scanned the clearing with professional thoroughness, the way his hand rested on his hip close to where a pistol would hang. This was no lost traveler. Ethan stepped out of the trees, making enough noise that both Grace and the stranger heard him coming. The man turned in his saddle, and Ethan got his first good look at the face. Sharp features, angular like something carved from stone, eyes pale, almost colorless. The kind of eyes that had seen too much death and stopped caring about it. "Help you?" Ethan asked, his voice flat and unfriendly. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Carter Blackwell," he said. "My horse needs water. Mind if I use your well?" "Well's around back," Ethan said. "Much obliged." Carter tipped his hat, but his eyes never left Grace. "You live here alone?" "Dangerous for a woman." Emma's voice came from inside the cabin. "Miss Grace, who is it?" Carter's eyes widened slightly. Recognition flickered across his face. "Grace," he said slowly. "Pretty name. Not short for Grace by chance." Grace's hand moved to the doorframe, her knuckles white. "You should leave now," she said. "Now there's no need for hostilities," Carter said, dismounting. "I'm just a man doing his job. $300 is good money for bringing in a fugitive nun who stole church property." Ethan's hand went to his knife. "The lady said you should leave." Carter looked at him, assessing. Soldier to soldier, predator to predator. "You're Cordell," he said. "Henry Morrison mentioned you, said you were a hard man, war veteran, keep to yourself." He paused. "Harboring a fugitive is a crime, you know. Could get you arrested right alongside her." "Could be," Ethan said. "Or could be you're trespassing on my land, and in these mountains we handle trespassers permanent-like." Carter's smile grew wider. "I like you, Cordell," he said. "You got spine. But here's how this is going to go. I'm going to ride down to Harper's Ridge and come back with the sheriff. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. Give you time to think about whether protecting this woman is worth going to jail for, or worse." He mounted his horse and looked down at Emma, who had come to stand in the doorway, her blind eyes staring past him. Something flickered in Carter's face, not quite sympathy, but close to it. "You're caring for a blind child," he said to Grace. "That's good work, but it doesn't change what you did." "I'll give you until morning," he said. "Then I'm coming back with the law. Get your affairs in order." He rode away, and Ethan watched until he disappeared into the trees. When he turned back, Grace was shaking, her face pale. Emma had wrapped both arms around her waist, holding tight. "He's going to take you away," Emma said, her voice small and frightened. Grace knelt down and pulled the girl into her arms. "No, sweetheart," she said. "I'll never leave you." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. When Carter came back with the sheriff, she would have to go. She couldn't let Ethan be arrested for harboring her. She couldn't let Emma lose the only father she had. Ethan watched them for a long moment. Then he walked into the cabin and began loading his rifle. Grace looked up at him, understanding what he was preparing to do. "Ethan, no," she said. "You can't fight the law. They'll hang you." "Won't be the first time I've had to fight when the odds weren't in my favor," Ethan said. He checked the ammunition, counting the rounds. "I survived 4 years of war, survived when better men died around me. I can handle one bounty hunter and a county sheriff." "But why?" Grace asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Ethan looked at Emma standing there with her hands clasped together, her blind eyes somehow seeing more than most sighted people ever would. Then he looked at Grace, saw the fear in her face and the courage beneath it. "Because my daughter needs you," he said, "and maybe I do too." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and profound. Emma's face broke into a smile. "I have an idea," the girl said suddenly. "If Miss Grace isn't a nun anymore, they can't take her back to the convent, right?" Ethan frowned. "What are you saying, girl?" Emma stepped forward, her face serious beyond her 9 years. "You marry her pa, make her Mrs. Cordell. Then she's not Sister Grace anymore. She's your wife, and the church can't touch her." The silence that followed was complete and absolute. Grace stared at Emma. Ethan stared at Grace. The fire popped. The wind moaned outside. And somewhere in the mountains, Carter Blackwell was riding toward Harper's Ridge to fetch the sheriff. Ethan spoke first, his voice rough as gravel. "That might work." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. "Ethan, I can't ask you to do that. You don't want to marry again, not after Anna." "No." Ethan agreed, his honesty brutal as always. "I don't, but I want you safe, and Emma's right. If you're my wife by law, the church has no claim on you. Neither does that bounty hunter." "But marriage is sacred," Grace said. "It's not just a piece of paper." Ethan walked to her and knelt, not from romance, but from respect. He looked up at her with those gray eyes that had seen too much death and not enough life. "Grace Brennan," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was offering. "I don't have a ring, don't have flowers, don't have a church or fancy words, but I have this cabin. I have the ability to protect you, and I have a daughter who needs a mother. That's what I can offer. Nothing more, nothing less." Grace felt tears building in her eyes. "Ethan, what about love?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't know if I can love again after Anna," he said finally. "But I don't hate you, and maybe that's enough to start with. Maybe love comes later if we're patient enough to wait for it." Grace looked into his eyes and saw the scars there, the same ones she carried. She saw the man who had saved her life, sheltered her, burned a wanted poster worth $300 rather than betray her. She saw someone who understood what it meant to be broken by the very people who claimed to protect you. "Then yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." Emma clapped her hands together, laughing with delight. Ethan stood slowly, uncertain of what came next. Grace reached out and took his hand, rough and scarred and strong. For the first time since she had arrived, they touched not out of necessity, but out of choice. "We need a minister," Grace said, "and Carter said he'd be back tomorrow." "Nearest minister is 3 days' ride from here," Ethan said. "We don't have that kind of time." As if in answer to a prayer neither of them had spoken, they heard hoofbeats again. But these were different, slower, the sound of a tired horse carrying a tired rider. Ethan grabbed his rifle and went to the door. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. An old man was riding into the clearing on a sway-backed mare that looked ready to collapse. He wore a priest's collar beneath a patched coat, and spectacles sat crooked on his nose. Everything about him spoke of poverty and hard miles and a life spent in service to people who couldn't afford to pay for it. "Evening," the old man called out. "I'm lost and my horse is about done. Was hoping for shelter. Just for the night. I can pay." Ethan's finger moved to the trigger. "No room," he said. The old man looked at him with sad, knowing eyes. "Please," he said. "The animal can't go much further. I'm no trouble, I promise you." Grace appeared beside Ethan in the doorway. Her hair was still unpinned, falling loose around her shoulders. The old man's eyes went to her, noting the absence of a veil, the way she stood close to Ethan, the way Emma clung to her skirt. Understanding crossed his face, but he said nothing, just waited. "Let him in, Ethan," Grace said quietly. "Please." Ethan looked at her, saw something in her expression. "You know what he is?" he said. "I know what we need him to be. Grace replied. Ethan lowered the rifle slowly. "Barn's out back," he said to the old man. "Tend your horse, then come inside." The old man nodded gratefully and led his mare away. Ethan turned to Grace. "You trust him?" "No," Grace said. But Emma was right. We need a minister. And God, if he exists, just delivered one to our door. God. Ethan said the word bitter in his mouth. More like coincidence. "Maybe," Grace said. "Or maybe something more." An hour later, the old man sat by their fire warming his hands around a cup of coffee Emma had poured for him. He introduced himself as Reverend James Walker, a circuit rider who traveled the mountains marrying folks, baptizing babies, and burying the dead in places too remote for proper churches. "Where are you headed, Reverend?" Grace asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Nowhere in particular," Walker said with a tired smile. "Everywhere in general. I go where I'm needed, or where I think I might be needed. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the old man with suspicion. "You're a long way from any town," he said. "The people who need God most are always a long way from anywhere," Walker replied. He looked at Grace, then at Ethan, noting the tension between them, the way they stood apart but watched each other. "Forgive me, but are you two married?" "Not yet," Grace said. "That's why we need you." Walker set down his cup. "I see. In a hurry." "That's our business," Ethan said flatly. "Fair enough," Walker agreed. "But I won't perform a marriage that's a sham. I've seen too many unions made for the wrong reasons. They always end badly." "This isn't a sham," Grace said quietly. Walker looked at her directly. "Do you love him?" Grace's breath caught. She forced herself to be honest. "I respect him, I trust him, and I need him. That's the truth." Walker turned to Ethan. "And you? Do you love her?" "No." Ethan said the word flat and final. "I loved my wife. She's dead. I don't know if I can love again." "Then why marry?" Walker asked. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "Because I respect her. I'll protect her. And I'll never hurt her. That enough for you?" Walker was quiet for a long time, studying them both. Then slowly he nodded. "You know," he said, "I've married 100 couples in my 30 years doing this work. Most of them swore they loved each other. Half were divorced or miserable within 5 years. The ones that lasted, they were built on respect, on partnership, on choosing each other every day, even when it was hard." He looked at Grace again, and his expression changed. "You're running from something, aren't you, daughter? I can see it in your eyes. That fear, I've seen it before." Grace stiffened. "What makes you say that?" Walker removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his sleeve. "Your hair," he said gently. "You're not wearing a veil, but I can see the line on your forehead where one sat for years. You have the bearing of a religious woman, even without the habit. And that fear in your eyes tells me you're running from your order." He paused, then added quietly, "I know that fear because I wore it once. I used to serve at a parish in Boston, under Mother Superior Adelaide of the Sisters of Mercy Convent." Grace gasped. Ethan's hand went to his knife. Walker raised his hands quickly, showing he meant no harm. "Peace," he said. "I left that place 5 years ago. Couldn't stomach what she was doing. The corruption, the cruelty, the way she used God as a weapon against people who had nowhere else to turn." His voice hardened. "I saw her sell a golden reliquary to a New York merchant, St. Patrick's set with emeralds. When I objected, she had me removed from my position, called me a heretic, a troublemaker, said I was turning people against the church." "The reliquary," Grace whispered. "St. Patrick's?" "The very same," Walker confirmed. $500 she got for it, money that should have fed orphans, money that should have gone to the poor. He looked at her with sharp eyes. "You're the one she blamed when it was discovered missing, aren't you? The one she framed to cover her own crime." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to stop her. I took it back before she could complete the sale. But she reported me first, faster than I could reach the bishop." Walker sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 50-plus years. "That woman is a demon in holy robes," he said, "and I'll be damned if I let her destroy another life." He looked at Ethan. "You want to protect this woman with your life?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "Then I'll marry you," Walker said. "Right now. Tonight. Before God and this child. And I'll sign the certificate with my seal. It'll be legal in every territory and state. That bounty hunter can't touch a married woman whose husband claims her." Grace and Ethan looked at each other. This was it, the point of no return. Once they did this, everything would change. There would be no going back. "Do it," Ethan said. Walker performed the ceremony there in front of the fireplace with no flowers and no music and no guests, except Emma, who sat on the bed holding a bundle of dried lavender she had found in a trunk that once belonged to Anna. Ethan wore his cleanest buckskin shirt. Grace wore a simple gray dress that had belonged to Anna, pulled from a chest Ethan hadn't opened in 4 years. It fit her perfectly, as if Anna had left it there for this exact moment, for this exact woman. Walker opened his worn Bible and began to speak, his voice filling the small cabin with words that had been spoken at weddings for centuries. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the presence of this witness to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." He looked at Ethan. "Ethan Cordell, do you take Grace Brennan to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to care for her in sickness and in health, in poverty and in wealth, forsaking all others, as long as you both shall live?" Ethan thought of Anna, of the promises he had made to her under an oak tree with no priest present, just the two of them, and the stars. Promises he had kept until she died in his arms. Could he promise again? Could he let himself? He looked at Grace and saw the scars on her wrists, saw the strength in her eyes, saw the woman who sang to his daughter and worked until her hands bled and stayed when running would have been easier. "I do," he said. Walker turned to Grace. "Grace Brennan, do you take Ethan Cordell to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to honor him, to stand with him in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, as long as you both shall live?" Grace looked at Ethan, at this man who had saved her life, who had burned a wanted poster worth $300, who carried the same scars she did, who understood what it meant to be broken by the people who should have protected you. "I do," she said. Walker smiled. "I don't have rings to give you, but a marriage is not made by gold. It's made by promise and deed." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the rosary he had been carving for weeks. 59 beads of black walnut, each one smooth and polished until it gleamed in the firelight. The cross at the end was simple and elegant, carved from a single piece of wood with a patience and care that spoke of something deeper than mere craftsmanship. He held it out to Grace. "You lost yours," he said. "This one's from me." Grace took it, her hands shaking. She traced the beads, feeling the hours of work in each one, the thought, the care. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Ethan," she said, "this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." "You deserve beautiful things," Ethan said simply. Walker cleared his throat, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "By the power vested in me by the Methodist Episcopal Church and the state of West Virginia, I pronounce you man and wife." He looked at Ethan. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan froze. He hadn't thought this far ahead, didn't know how to be gentle anymore after years of surviving on his own in these harsh mountains. Emma's voice came from the bed. "Oh, you have to kiss Miss Grace, Pa." Grace smiled through her tears and gave the smallest nod. Ethan stepped closer. He was a full head taller than her broad where she was slender. He cupped her face with one rough hand and tilted her chin up. The kiss was brief and chaste, just a brush of lips, but the electricity that ran between them was anything but innocent. When Ethan pulled back, his eyes were dark. Grace's breath came quick. Walker produced a piece of parchment from his saddlebag and wrote in careful script, "This certifies that Ethan Cordell and Grace Brennan were joined in holy matrimony on this day, December 23, 1873, in the presence of God and witness Emma Cordell, performed by Reverend James Walker, ordained minister. He signed it with a flourish, then pressed his seal into hot wax. The official mark of the Methodist Church. He handed it to Ethan. "She's your wife now. In the eyes of God and the law, no bounty hunter can touch her without going through you first." "Thank you, Reverend," Ethan said. "Don't thank me yet," Walker replied. "You'll have to work at this every day. Marriage isn't easy even when it starts with love. When it starts with necessity, it's twice as hard." "Nothing worth having is easy," Ethan said. Walker gathered his things but then paused. "Something tells me I should stay a few more days, until I know you're truly safe. Sometimes God whispers. I've learned to listen." After Walker left for the barn to sleep, the cabin fell into an awkward silence. Ethan and Grace stood on opposite sides of the room, husband and wife now, but still strangers in so many ways. Emma yawned. "I'm tired, Pa." "Go to bed, girl," Ethan said softly. Emma crawled into her small bed in the corner and pulled the blankets up. Within minutes her breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Grace looked at the larger bed, the one where Ethan had always slept, the one where Anna had died. "I'll take the floor," Ethan said quietly. "Ethan, we're married," Grace said. "You don't have to sleep on the floor." "I won't touch you unless you want me to," he said, "even if that's never." Grace crossed the room and took his hand. "I know you won't," she said. "That's why I trust you." She led him to the bed, and they lay down on opposite sides, a careful distance between them, both still fully clothed. For a long time neither of them moved. Then Grace spoke into the darkness. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for everything." Ethan's voice came rough and low. "Don't thank me yet. The hard part's still coming." Outside the wind picked up, and somewhere in the darkness Carter Blackwell was making his way toward Harper's Ridge, preparing to return with the sheriff and whatever deputies he could muster. The storm was gathering, but this time Ethan and Grace would face it together. 2 days later they came. Ethan saw them from the ridge where he was checking his traps, 4 riders moving through the snow in a loose formation that spoke of men who knew how to work together. Carter Blackwell rode in front, his black gelding picking its way carefully through the drifts. Behind him came a fat man on a bay horse wearing a tin star that caught the morning light. Sheriff Tucker Ethan guessed. And behind the sheriff, 2 deputies with rifles across their saddles. Ethan ran. He had maybe 15 minutes before they reached the cabin, and he needed to use every second. His boots pounded through the snow, his breath coming hard in the thin mountain air, his old war wound sending spikes of pain through his shoulder with every jarring step. But he didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. He burst through the cabin door, breathing hard. Grace looked up from where she was teaching Emma to knead bread dough, her hands white with flour. She saw his face and understood immediately. "Get in the root cellar," Ethan said. "Both of you, now." Emma scrambled to her feet. "Pa, what's happening?" "Just do it, girl. Don't argue." Grace pulled up the trap door hidden beneath the bearskin rug. Below was a small space barely 5 feet deep where Ethan stored potatoes and turnips through the winter. It was cold and dark and smelled of earth, but it would hide them. Emma climbed down first, her blind eyes wide with fear. Grace followed, pausing at the edge to look back at Ethan. "Don't kill them," she said. "I'll try," Ethan replied, which was the best he could offer. He closed the trap door, threw the rug back over it, and grabbed his Sharps rifle. He checked the load. 5 rounds. Enough to kill every man riding toward his cabin, if it came to that. He had killed 23 men during the war. 4 more wouldn't make much difference to his soul, which was already damned anyway. He stepped onto the porch and waited. The riders came into the clearing slowly. Sheriff Tucker raising one hand in what might have been a gesture of peace or might have been a signal to his deputies. The sheriff was a big man, round in the belly, with a drooping mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much of human nature and not enough of human decency. "Cordell," the sheriff called out. "I know the woman's in there. Just hand her over and we'll have no trouble." "There's no woman here," Ethan said, his voice flat and hard. "Just my wife." Carter Blackwell laughed a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "Your wife," he said. "You married a fugitive nun in 2 days. Come on, Cordell, don't insult my intelligence." Ethan pulled the marriage certificate from his coat and held it up. "Reverend Walker performed the ceremony. I have the certificate, signed and sealed, legal in every territory and state." Sheriff Tucker squinted at the document. He could see the seal from where he sat, could see that it was real. He scratched his head, looking troubled. "Well now," he said, "this complicates things. If she's married legal, then by state law—" "The law doesn't matter." Carter's voice cracked like a whip. "That woman stole church property. She's a thief and a liar. The marriage is a fraud." "My wife stole nothing," Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. Each word was measured and precise, like rounds being loaded into a rifle. "Then where's the reliquary?" Carter demanded. "The golden one, worth $500. Where is it?" Grace's voice came from behind Ethan. He spun around. She had come up from the root cellar, was walking toward the porch with the reliquary in her hands. Emma followed, clutching Grace's skirt. "Grace, get back inside," Ethan said. "No," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. She walked past him and stood at the edge of the porch facing the 4 armed men. "You want this?" she said to Carter. "Take it." She threw the reliquary to him. Carter caught it, surprise flickering across his face. He turned it over in his hands, examining it, and then his expression changed. He opened the golden case. It was empty. The deputies leaned in to look. Sheriff Tucker's eyes widened. "What the hell?" he muttered. Carter shook the reliquary as if the missing relic might fall out if he just tried hard enough. Nothing. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Where's the actual relic?" "The real relic was sold 6 months ago," Grace said, her voice clear and strong. "Mother Superior Adelaide sold it to a merchant named Cornelius Vandermeer in New York for $500. I have the letters proving it." She pulled a folded piece of paper from inside her dress, where she had kept it hidden against her skin since leaving Boston. The correspondence between Adelaide and Vandermeer discussing price and delivery, written in the Mother Superior's own hand. Sheriff Tucker took the letter and read it slowly, his face growing redder with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Grace. "If this is true," he said, "then Mother Superior Adelaide is the thief, not you." "It's a forgery!" Carter shouted. "It has to be." "Actually, it's not," said a voice from the edge of the clearing. Everyone turned. Reverend Walker stood there, having walked up from the barn where he had spent the last 2 nights. He looked older in the morning light, more fragile, but his voice was strong. "I'm Reverend James Walker," he said. "I served at the Boston Parish under Mother Adelaide for 10 years. I can verify that this letter is genuine. I've seen her handwriting thousands of times, and I personally witnessed her sell 3 relics before I was forced to leave. The diocese is investigating her even now. She's been embezzling from the church for 5 years. Carter's face twisted with rage. He had been played, sent on a 3-week hunt through the mountains for a woman who was innocent, while the real criminal sat safe in Boston counting her stolen money. No reliquary meant no reward. He had wasted weeks of his life for nothing. "This is bullshit," he snarled, and his hand went to his gun. Ethan was faster. The Sharps rifle came up, the hammer already cocked. But Carter was drawing to desperation, making him reckless. For a moment time seemed to freeze. Ethan could see Carter's hand closing on the pistol grip, could see the exact angle of the draw, could calculate in his mind where the bullet would go if Carter got his shot off first. The gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass. Carter's bullet hit Ethan in the left shoulder, spinning him halfway around. The impact was like being hit with a hammer, followed immediately by white-hot pain that exploded through his entire left side. He staggered, but didn't fall. The rifle was already moving, tracking Carter even as Ethan's body tried to process the damage it had just sustained. Ethan's bullet hit Carter's center mass. The bounty hunter dropped like a stone, blood spreading dark and fast across the snow. His horse shied away and Carter's body rolled slightly, coming to rest face down in the white powder that was already turning red beneath him. The deputies raised their rifles, fingers on triggers. Sheriff Tucker shouted, "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Ethan swayed on his feet. The rifle fell from his hands. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking through his shirt and coat. He dropped to his knees, the world tilting sideways. Grace screamed. She ran to him, caught him before he hit the ground completely. Emma was crying, her hands reaching out blindly. "Papa! Papa, don't leave me!" Sheriff Tucker dismounted heavily and walked to Carter's body. He checked for a pulse, found none. "He's dead," the sheriff said simply. One of the deputies pointed his rifle at Ethan. "He murdered him in cold blood." "Self-defense," Walker said firmly, stepping forward. "I saw it all. Mr. Blackwell drew first. Mr. Cordell was defending himself and his family." The sheriff looked at Ethan bleeding in his wife's arms, looked at Emma crying for her father, looked at the marriage certificate lying in the snow stamped with an official church seal. He made a decision. "It's self-defense," he said. "Clear as day. Deputies help get Cordell inside. We'll bury Blackwell come morning." They carried Ethan into the cabin and laid him on the bed. His shoulder was a mess of torn flesh and blood. The bullet had gone clean through, which meant Grace wouldn't have to dig it out, but the exit wound was ragged and large, a hole that seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart. Grace moved with sudden efficiency, all fear replaced by focus. "Emma," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I need clean cloth and boiling water. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded and moved through the cabin with surprising speed, her blindness no obstacle in the familiar space. She knew where everything was kept, knew how to work the fire, knew how to be useful when it mattered most. Grace retrieved Ethan's medical kit from its place on the shelf, a small leather case worn from years of use. Inside were needles, thread bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for sterilization. Basic field medicine, the kind every mountain man kept for emergencies. Sheriff Tucker watched from the corner, his expression unreadable. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. "I trained at Sisters of Mercy Hospital," Grace said, threading a needle with steady hands. "Before I took my vows, I was a nurse. I've sewn up worse than this." She cut away Ethan's shirt, exposing the wound fully. The bullet had entered just below the collarbone and exited through the back of his shoulder, missing the bone but tearing through muscle and possibly nicking an artery. The bleeding was heavy, but not arterial. If she could stop it, he would live. She poured whiskey over the wound. Ethan's back arched off the bed, a sound tearing from his throat that was barely human. But he bit down on the leather belt Emma had shoved between his teeth and didn't scream. He had been shot before during the war. He knew how this went. Grace stitched the entry wound first, her hands moving with practiced precision. Small, tight stitches to close the hole and stop the bleeding. Then she carefully rolled him onto his side to reach the exit wound. This one was worse, a ragged hole the size of a silver dollar. She packed it first with clean cloth, then stitched around the edges, pulling the torn flesh together as best she could. Ethan's hand found hers, squeezed hard enough to hurt. "You're doing good," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "Don't talk," Grace said. "Save your strength." She worked for over an hour. When she finally finished, Ethan's shoulder was bandaged tight, the bleeding stopped. He would have another scar to add to his collection, but he would live. That was all that mattered. Sheriff Tucker wrote his report that night by lamplight, his handwriting cramped and difficult to read. "Self-defense, justified shooting. Carter Blackwell deceased. No charges against Ethan Cordell." He looked at Grace when he finished. "Ma'am," he said, "you won't be pursued anymore. I'll send this report to Boston myself. Far as I'm concerned, you're innocent and legally married. The church has no claim on you now." Grace sagged with relief, all the tension draining out of her at once. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me," Tucker said. "Thank your husband. He took a bullet for you. That's more than most men would do." The sheriff and his deputies left at dawn the next morning, taking Carter's body with them. They buried him in the woods a mile from the cabin in an unmarked grave that would be forgotten as soon as the snow melted. No one would mourn Carter Blackwell. He had lived by violence and died by it, and that was the end of his story. Walker stayed for 2 more days until he was certain Ethan would recover. Before he left, he pulled Grace aside. "You've got a good man there," he said. "Rough around the edges, but good where it counts. Don't let him go." "I won't," Grace promised. "And when he's healed, Walker continued. "Make sure he knows you chose this, that you didn't marry him just to escape. Men like Ethan need to know they're wanted, not just needed. There's a difference, and it matters." Grace nodded, the wisdom settling into her heart like seed into soil. She watched Walker ride away on his tired mare, disappearing into the trees, and wondered if she would ever see him again. Probably not. Circuit riders like him lived their whole lives on the move, never staying long enough to put down roots. 2 weeks later, Ethan could move his arm again. The shoulder was stiff and would always be stiff, the scar tissue binding the muscle in ways that limited his range of motion. But it was functional, and that was enough. He sat by the fire one evening, whittling a doll for Emma, while Grace sat across from him, mending the shirt she had cut away during the surgery. The silence between them had changed over the past 2 weeks. It was no longer the silence of strangers forced together by circumstance. It had become something else, something comfortable, companionable. The silence of two people who had learned to exist in the same space without friction. Grace set down her mending and looked at him. "Ethan," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," he said, not looking up from his work. "We've been married almost a month now," Grace said, "but you haven't touched me, not since the wedding. Are you sorry? Do you regret marrying me?" Ethan's knife stopped moving. He set down the half-carved doll and looked at her directly. "Regret," he said. "No, I don't regret it." "Then why do you keep your distance?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I respect you too much to force anything," he said finally. "This marriage started as necessity, as protection. I won't make it a prison by demanding things you're not ready to give." Grace stood and walked to him. She knelt so they were eye to eye, her hands resting on his knees. "What if I'm ready?" she asked softly. "What if I want more than just partnership?" Ethan's breath caught. "Grace, you don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I'm doing it. Because I want to. Because somewhere along the way between the storm and the shooting and all the days in between, I stopped seeing you as just my protector. I started seeing you as my husband. And I think maybe you started seeing me as more than just someone you were obligated to shelter." She took his hand and placed it against her cheek. The same gesture from their wedding night, but with different meaning now. Ethan's thumb stroked her skin, rough calluses catching on her smooth face. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more sure of anything," Grace said. He stood and pulled her up with him, his good arm going around her waist. Her hands found his shoulders, careful of the injury. "If you want me to stop," he said, "you tell me. Any time." "I won't want you to stop," Grace whispered. The kiss was not like their wedding kiss. That had been chaste and formal, a sealing of vows in front of witnesses. This was hungry and desperate weeks of tension releasing all at once. Ethan's hand tangled in her hair. Grace's fingers gripped his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Ethan led her to the bed where Emma slept behind the curtain they had drawn across her corner of the cabin. He and Grace lay down together, and this time there was no distance between them, no careful space, no holding back. What happened next was gentle and awkward and perfect. Two broken people learning to be whole together. Two scarred souls finding healing in the touch of someone who understood what it meant to survive. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, Ethan's arm around Grace's waist, her head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "Ethan," she whispered, "I think I'm falling in love with you." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I know I'm falling in love with you," he said. From behind the curtain, Emma's sleepy voice came through the darkness. "Finally. I was wondering when you two would figure it out." They laughed, quiet and full of something that might have been called joy. A month later, in late February, a letter arrived. Henry Morrison brought it forwarded through Harper's Ridge from Boston. The envelope bore the seal of the Boston Diocese. Grace opened it with shaking hands, Ethan standing beside her. Together they read the words that would change everything. "Dear Mrs. Cordell, This letter serves to inform you that Mother Superior Adelaide has been removed from her position and is under investigation for embezzlement and fraud. The Holy Reliquary of St. Patrick was indeed sold illegally, and you have been cleared of all charges. Furthermore, the diocese acknowledges that your vows were taken under duress and manipulation. We hereby release you from all religious obligations. You are free to live as you choose. May God bless your union. Bishop Bernard Fitzgerald. Grace read the letter 3 times as if the words might change if she looked away. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table. "It's over," she said. "It's really over." Ethan pulled her into his arms. "You're free." "I was free the day I married you," Grace said. But their peace was short-lived. 3 days later another letter arrived. This one was from a lawyer named Thaddeus Price representing what remained of Mother Adelaide's interests. The letter claimed that Grace had kidnapped the Holy Reliquary and must return it immediately or face excommunication and criminal prosecution. It cited obscure church law about vows taken under divine authority being permanent and unbreakable. Grace's hands shook as she read it. "What if they drag us into court, Ethan? I'm carrying your child. I can't make that journey to Boston, not in my condition." Ethan looked at her, seeing for the first time the slight swell of her belly beneath her dress. "You're pregnant," he said. "Yes," Grace said. "I've been trying to find the right time to tell you." Ethan's face went through several emotions at once. Shock, fear, something that might have been joy. Then the fear came back stronger. He thought of Anna dying in childbirth, thought of the blood and the screaming and the terrible silence that followed. Grace took his face in her hands. "Look at me," she said firmly. "I'm healthy. I'm strong. And we have Reverend Walker's testimony if we need it. This isn't Anna's story. This is our story." Ethan's voice came out rough. "I can't lose you." "You won't," Grace promised. "But we need to end this. We need to go to Charleston and see the bishop in person, get this settled once and for all." So they made the journey. It took a week traveling slow for Grace's condition. Henry Morrison rode with them, his presence both protection and companionship. They stopped often to rest, and at night Ethan held Grace close, one hand on her belly, feeling the child growing inside her and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Bishop Bernard Fitzgerald received them in his office at the Charleston diocese. He was an elderly man, white-haired and kind-eyed, wearing simple robes that spoke of humility rather than power. Grace explained everything: the lawyer's letter, the threats, the pregnancy, her desire to finally be free of the past that kept trying to claim her. The bishop listened carefully. Then he asked, "Do you still have the reliquary?" "No," Grace said. "We sold it. The money went to doctors, but they said Emma's blindness was permanent. Nothing could be done. We used what remained for this journey and to expand the cabin. And the money. All spent," Ethan confirmed, "on doctors and medicine and the journey." The bishop smiled. "Then there's nothing to return, is there?" He wrote a letter on official diocese stationery and sealed it with his ring. "Give this to anyone who questions you. It states clearly that you are free from all religious obligations and that Mother Adelaide has no authority over you. If this lawyer persists, he'll answer to me." Grace took the letter with trembling hands. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Don't thank me," the bishop said. "You've done nothing wrong. Now go home, Mrs. Cordell. Raise your children. Be happy. That's the best revenge against those who tried to break you." As they left, the bishop called after them, "And Mr. Cordell, thank you for protecting her, for loving her. That's what God intended all along." Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. December came with snow, but not the killing kind. Soft flakes that settled gentle on the mountains, turning the world clean and white. Grace's time came on Christmas Eve, right on schedule according to her calculations. They had arranged weeks earlier for Dr. Jonathan Hayes to come to the cabin for the birth. The doctor arrived 2 days early, a careful man in his 40s who brought his medical bag, and his nurse, a capable woman named Ruth, who had delivered more babies than she could count. Ethan paced like a caged wolf. The memories were too strong, too vivid. Anna's screams, the blood, the terrible moment when everything went silent. He couldn't go through that again. Couldn't watch another woman he loved die because he was helpless to save her. Henry took Emma to his cabin 15 miles away so the girl wouldn't have to hear if things went badly. But things didn't go badly. Grace labored for 8 hours hard work, but not dangerous. Dr. Hayes monitored her carefully, his calm presence steadying everyone in the room. Just after midnight, as Christmas Day began, a baby's cry filled the cabin. "It's a boy," Dr. Hayes announced, placing the infant in Grace's arms. "Healthy and strong, 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that work just fine." Grace looked down at the tiny red face, the fuzz of dark hair, and started crying. Ethan knelt beside the bed, one rough finger touching his son's head with infinite gentleness. The baby's hand wrapped around it, the grip surprisingly strong. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered. "You're both perfect." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Ethan thought of the reliquary of St. Patrick whose image had been engraved on the gold, the saint who had driven snakes from Ireland, who had brought light to darkness. But Patrick didn't feel right somehow. "Samuel," he said finally. "We'll call him Samuel." It was a biblical name, meaning God heard, an acknowledgement that somehow, despite everything, their prayers had been answered. Not the prayers Ethan had stopped saying years ago, but the unspoken ones, the ones written in actions rather than words. Grace smiled through her tears. "Samuel Cordell, it's perfect." They brought Emma home the next day. She stared at her baby brother with wonder, her blind eyes somehow seeming to see him anyway. She touched his tiny hands and feet with infinite gentleness. "He's so small," she whispered. "Was I that small?" "Smaller," Ethan said. "You were barely 5 pounds when you were born." Emma looked up at him, and even though she couldn't see his face, she seemed to understand everything in it. "Pa," she asked, "are you happy?" Ethan looked around the cabin, at his wife tired but glowing holding their son, at his daughter, her eyes bright and clear even if they couldn't see, at the life they had built from nothing but determination and love. "Yes," he said, and meant it completely. "I'm happy." Time moved forward as it always does. The years blurred together in a way that happens when life becomes full of small joys rather than large tragedies. Samuel grew strong and healthy with his mother's red hair and his father's gray eyes. Emma learned to read and write, taught by Grace, using books that Reverend Walker brought on his occasional visits. She became Ethan's shadow on the trap lines, learning the mountains the way he knew them with an intimacy that went beyond sight. Grace's garden flourished. She began treating the sick from nearby homesteads, using the medical knowledge from her nursing days. Word spread, and people came from miles away for her help. She never asked for payment, but they brought what they could: food, cloth, tools, the currency of mountain folk who had more heart than money. The cabin expanded. Ethan built a second room for Emma, then a third for Samuel. What had been a lonely fortress became a home. Henry Morrison visited regularly, bringing news and supplies and stories. Reverend Walker came through twice a year, performing marriages and baptisms, and always staying for supper and good conversation. In 1880, 7 years after that first blizzard, Ethan was 39 years old. Grace was 33. Emma was 16, being courted by a young trapper from Harper's Ridge. Samuel was 6, wild and free as the mountains themselves. One evening they stood together on the ridge behind the cabin, all 4 of them looking down at the valley. Samuel asked, "Pa, why did you stay here? You could have gone anywhere." Ethan looked at Grace. She smiled, knowing what he would say. "Because this is where I found myself again," Ethan said. "Where I learned that losing everything doesn't mean you can't build something new, something better." He pulled his family close. "This mountain gave me everything that matters. It gave me all of you." Autumn 1920. Ethan Cordell. 79 years old, finished his story. William sat on the porch beside him, tears streaming down his young face. "Grandma saved you," the boy said, And you saved her." "We saved each other," Ethan corrected gently. He stood, his joints creaking with age, and walked inside the cabin. When he returned, he held the rosary. The beads were worn smooth from Grace's fingers from 47 years of prayers. "This was hers," Ethan said, placing it in William's hands. "Now it's yours." William took it reverently. "I'll keep it always, Grandpa." "Good," Ethan said. "And remember what it represents. Not religion, not rules, but love, sacrifice, second chances, the courage to build when everything has been torn down." He looked out over the mountains, his eyes distant, seeing not the present, but the past. "Your grandmother died 2 years ago," he said. "Influenza, same thing that took your parents. But we had 45 years together, raised 2 children, saw 4 grandchildren born." He touched the rosary in William's hands. She prayed on this every night, even at the end, not praying to a distant God, praying for strength, for wisdom, for the people she loved. "Did her prayers work?" William asked. Ethan smiled, something he rarely did anymore. "Every single one." The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple. Ethan sat back in his rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath him like it had for decades. "You'll stay here with me, boy," he said. "I'll teach you the mountains, how to trap, how to hunt, how to survive. But more than that, I'll teach you how to live, how to love, how to be the kind of man worth loving back." William nodded, clutching the rosary. "I will, Grandpa. I promise." Ethan closed his eyes. In his mind he saw them all. Anna young and beautiful, her hand on his cheek. Emma blind but whole, who learned to see with more than eyes, her wisdom deeper than sight could ever teach. Samuel running through the forest wild and free. Henry Morrison sitting by a campfire with endless stories. And Grace, always Grace, her red hair in firelight, her scarred hands in his, her voice singing Irish songs while she worked. The way she had looked at him on their wedding night, trusting him with everything she was. The way she had held their son for the first time. The way she had grown old beside him, her hair turning from red to white, her face gaining lines that somehow made her more beautiful rather than less. "Some people come into your life in a storm," Ethan said softly, "and they bring the spring." William didn't fully understand yet, but someday he would. Someday he would know what it meant to be broken and then made whole by someone who understood. Someday he would carry this story forward and tell it to his own children, and the legacy would continue. The old man and the boy sat together as darkness fell. Below them the cabin stood solid and strong, its logs weathered but enduring. Inside it, generations of love had soaked into the wood, into the stone of the fireplace, into the very earth beneath. The mountains stood eternal, keeping their ancient watch. The 2 graves beneath the oak tree were covered in wildflowers, now purple asters and black-eyed Susans that Grace had planted years ago. And the rosary, warm in William's hands, held the prayers of a woman who had learned that faith was not about churches or priests or rules written in stone. Faith was about believing that tomorrow could be better than today, that love was stronger than fear, that the broken could be made whole. That sometimes in the darkest winter, when all hope seemed lost, a stranger appeared in the snow and everything changed forever. The mountains remembered, the cabin held its secrets, and the rosary passed from one generation to the next, whispered the only prayer that ever really mattered. "Hold on. Love harder. The spring is coming.